Today, we're going to fix the fuel-injected, liquid-cooled V-Twin engine that powers this used and abused 2014 Kawasaki Mule. No doubt this buggy's seen some stuff and somehow it survived. Now the clock on this 11-year-old side-by-side is showing a massive 1,735 hours. Now this amount of hours can be a lot depending on how the vehicle was maintained. This thing definitely has battle scars here and there, including this unusual dent in the bed. Gotta wonder how that happened. It's definitely had a hard life, that's for sure. The good news is, it still runs and drives, and I was able to drive this thing onto my trailer and haul it back to the shop. You know, this thing is almost as big as my little S10 pickup truck. It's crazy how everything just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Anyway, let's take a look under the hood and see what kind of mess we've gotten ourselves into. This project may have been a bad idea. So there it is, a liquid-cooled, fuel-injected Kawasaki V-Twin. Yeah, I know it's hard to tell it's a V-Twin, but I assure you it is. Now this thing is definitely dirty, but it could be a lot worse. The fuel injection system on this engine is massive, and that's because Kawasaki eliminated the mechanical governor and replaced it with an electronic governor. So this thing actually has two throttles that are in series. It's an interesting system, that's for sure. Now let's see how bad this engine runs. Well, it starts right up, so that's good news. Now the bad news is the smoke that's coming out of the muffler. You see, this thing ain't burning oil, it's burning antifreeze. Go ahead and get a good whiff of this stuff. Yup, that sweet smelling exhaust is bad news, and it could be the thing that gets this buggy sent to the scrapyard. So a sweet smelling exhaust typically means there's a leak between the cooling system and the combustion chamber. Now 9 times out of 10, it's the result of a blown head gasket. Now a blown head gasket can be repaired, but depending on how long this engine was operated with a blown gasket, well, that could lead to even more problems. Alright, let's pause the video for a moment. Right here is the DFI light, and DFI stands for digital fuel injection. Anyway, this light is sort of like the check engine light on a car. The good news is, the DFI light is not on, so what that means is the fuel injection system's working and we don't have potentially more problems on the horizon. Now right over here we can see a buildup of mud, but it's not really mud. It turns out this is oil from the crankcase mixed with dirt. So what that means is there's just way too much pressure in the crankcase and it's pushing oil back through the air filter and it's mixing with the dirt. So we can more or less figure that the problem with the engine didn't happen yesterday and it's been going on for a while. At least long enough to establish a dirt and oil layer under the air filter. So that's somewhat alarming. Let's check the dipstick. Wow, this sucker is really long. We definitely have milky brown oil, and that ain't good. So there's coolant mixed with the oil, and this is going to get real messy. The plan is to dig into the top half of the engine and see what we can see. Hopefully it's repairable, and if it is, well, I reckon it's going to cost about $100 worth of parts to fix it. I think the bed on this buggy needs to come off, so I have a lot more room to work with. You know, I'm just not a fan of working in tight spaces. Looks like pulling this pin and this pin is all we really need to do to disconnect the bed from the rest of this contraption. Fast forward a little bit, and we have the engine hoist attached to the bed of the ATV. Now this may seem a little bit sketchy, but I used this same method to pull the bed on my S10 pickup when I had to replace the fuel pump. Let's give it a go and see what happens. Well, I ended up having to use a third strap to balance the bed, so let's just keep going. And the bed is finally off. This should make working on this thing a lot easier. Now, since we're going to be elbow deep into this engine, well, I want the engine and everything around it to be as clean as possible. There's nothing worse than working on something that's nasty and dirty. Now, sometimes it can't be helped, but since I do have a pressure washer, I'm going to do my best to get this thing as clean as possible because not only is it easier to work on, it also looks better in the videos. I know a lot of my viewers will appreciate me cleaning this engine before I start working on it. So I let the degreaser soak for about a half hour, and now it's time to blast off all the dirt. This mule is actually owned by a friend of mine, and it's used on a cattle farm. So it does have traces of cow poop on it here and there, so we'll try to get most of that stuff off as well. Fast forward a few hours, and now we can start working on this thing. Let's start by draining the oil. Oh yeah, it's nasty. Plus, there's also a strong odor of gasoline coming from the oil. So typically, you can tell which cylinder's having a problem by just looking at the spark plugs. A spark plug that's super clean will be a clue, so let's have a look at the plugs. Well, this is interesting. Both plugs are about the same and neither one is clean, so that didn't get us anywhere. The good news is, these are NGK plugs, so at least this thing was maintained using OEM type plugs. This air filter housing is going to have to come off because it's likely full of nasty oil and it's going to need some cleaning for sure. Oh yeah, the intake hose is flooded with a nasty mix of oil and coolant. Yuck. Alright, let's dig into this engine and see what's going on. Since this engine's tightly packed in the engine bay, I'm going to be wearing my Kevlar sleeves to protect my arms from getting even more scars. Anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the harness for the fuel injection system first. Alright, Houston, we have a problem. It looks like both throttle position sensors use the same type of connector, so when I reassemble this thing, well, there's the possibility for a mistake, so I'm going to have to take a snapshot of the connectors, and when I reassemble this thing, I can plug these connectors in the right way. So this 2014 Mule has a simple open-loop fuel injection system. It uses a MAP sensor, a coolant temperature sensor, an air inlet temp sensor, and a crank position sensor. And it also has two throttle position sensors. One throttle position sensor is for the normal throttle, and the other sensor is for the electronic throttle or the governor. Now this is interesting. On this contraption, they're not using an oxygen sensor, and what that means is there's no feedback on the air-fuel mixture. It's an interesting decision they made not to use an O2 sensor, but it seems to work. Now, according to various manuals that can be found online, the bolts for the intake manifold need to be removed in a special sequence. Well, I didn't get that memo. Well, it looks like we didn't get all the dirt washed off this engine. Next, we have to remove the exhaust system. Now, I did spray penetrating oil on all the fasteners because the last thing I want to do is deal with a broken bolt. And the exhaust is off. So before taking on this job, I did do some research and found a few manuals online. Now, it turns out the manuals that I looked at all pertain to the early version of this engine with a carburetor. The instructions for disassembly were extremely convoluted. It seems like when translating Japanese to English, they may have made a few errors in the original manual. Now, I did reach out to one of my subscribers, and he let me have a sneak peek at a current service manual for the fuel-injected engine, and it looks like Kawasaki has revised the instructions, and it's not as convoluted. Anyway, if you're thinking about working on a fuel-injected mule, don't use the free manuals that are online. Just go ahead and purchase a real manual from the dealer. You won't regret it. Let's have a look at the cylinder head. Well, the gasket delaminated when I took the head off, so that's not very helpful. It's hard to tell, but from the way the carbon deposits have eroded, it looks like this cylinder head was ingesting antifreeze. So this could be the problem cylinder, but we're going to have to take the other cylinder head off just to be sure. Fast forward and I have removed the bolts from the other cylinder head. Now, the early manuals indicate that there's a difference in the head bolts, but on this engine, all the bolts look the same. Interesting. Let's pop the head off. So this head seems to have more carbon deposits, and that indicates this cylinder may not have been a problem. So if we look at the side of the head, well, this is the water jacket and this is the inlet port. Now on this side of the engine, I did notice the bolts holding the intake manifold on were significantly looser. It's hard to say, but perhaps the actual problem was a bad intake manifold gasket. It sucks not knowing for sure. Anyway, I'm going to need to clean these heads up to check for cracks. Now this is a quick and easy cheat to clean off most of the carbon from the heads, and the trick is to spray them with aluminum safe paint stripper. This stuff will dissolve the carbon pretty quick. Now something like Easy Off oven cleaner will also work, but that stuff will attack the aluminum. Anyway, we'll let this sit in the shade for about 20 minutes and then hit it with the pressure washer. So fast forward a little bit, and the paint stripper and the pressure washer got most of the crud off, and the cylinder heads check out fine with no visible cracks. So to finish cleaning these heads, I'm going to use an ultra soft nylon disc on my drill. Now this disc is extremely soft, and it's not aggressive enough to rip through these flimsy rubber gloves, so it's perfectly safe to use this on the aluminum heads. Both cylinder heads cleaned up nicely with not a lot of effort, and I did take a second look at them and didn't see any visible cracks. So remember folks, this is not an airplane engine that I'm working on, and good enough is about as best I can do with a $100 budget. Also, both heads checked out good, and I couldn't find any signs of warping. So this gives us the green light to reassemble the engine and see if all the new gaskets will fix the problem this engine was having. Now, according to the outdated service manual, the push rods need to go back exactly where they came from. Now, this is always good practice on any engine, and I don't need a service manual to tell me that. However, it would seem the tolerances on the push rods on the early carbureted engines were not exactly stellar, and the push rods absolutely need to go back in their original locations. So, what the hell, Kawasaki? Now, personally, I have a tough time believing a Japanese engine would be built using out-of-spec parts. So, I'm not really sure what's going on, but according to the forums, folks had issues when they mixed the parts up, so it's kind of interesting. So this is where it gets bizarre. Now again, according to the older and somewhat confusing service manual, the cylinder heads need to be torqued down in many steps. The final torque value is 22 Newton meters, but in order to get there, you have to go in 3 Newton meters in each step. That is until you get to around 18 Newton meters on both cylinder heads. At that point, you're supposed to install the intake manifold, then torque the manifold down, and then finish torquing down the cylinder heads. Now, in the newer service manuals, well, they don't even mention the part about the intake manifold needing to be installed while torquing down the heads. Plus, in the newer manual, they actually have a completely different torque sequence on the cylinder heads. I don't know, this seems a little bit fishy, but that's what I did. So when it comes to installing the intake manifold, I used Honda Bond on the gaskets because, well, Hondas don't leak oil. Now, to be fair, Kawasaki also has a similar glue called Kawa Bond. Honda Bond is what I have in stock, and Hondas don't leak oil, so Honda Bond it is. Now it turns out, Honda Bond can be used on Kawasaki's, Yamahas, Suzuki's, BMWs, Mercedes, Chevys, Triumph Spitfires, Cadillacs, Saturns, and whatever else that needs a little bit of something something. It's not just for Hondas, and this stuff will not disappoint. Okay, now the intake manifold's installed, we can continue torquing down the cylinder heads. So the valve flash on this engine is a massive 10,000ths of an inch, or 0.025 millimeter. That seems like a lot, but it's what the manual says. So pretty much the rest of the engine goes back together exactly the way it came apart, and there's no more surprises. Well, there shouldn't be, but I ended up installing the throttle position connectors backwards. So this is the snapshot I took when I disassembled the engine, and this is how I put it back together. It turns out my memory is not perfect, and I do make mistakes. Anyway, swapping the throttle position sensor wires will immediately trigger the DFI or check engine light. However, the engine will start. I figured this out pretty quickly once I saw the DFI light on after the first start. Okay, so this contraption's back together and the cooling system's been completely filled. I ended up using a turkey baster to fill the last bit of the cooling system from the thermostat housing. Now, with the bleeder open on the intake manifold, it took about a half hour to fill the cooling system to 100%, and there shouldn't be any air bubbles in the system. Alright, let's fire this thing up. Now let me pause the video so we can replay the startup one more time, and I want you to listen to the way the idle changes a few moments after the engine starts. Now the reason the idle changes is because at this point I still have the throttle position sensor wires connected backwards, and the computer figured it out almost immediately and triggered the DFI light. Once the DFI light came on, the engine went into sort of a limp home mode. So it's really not a big deal and nothing was damaged. It was just interesting to see how the computer put the vehicle in a mode where the engine still ran, but the performance was greatly reduced. Anyway, I did figure this issue out pretty quickly. So this is the part that I knew was going to happen, and we still have white smoke coming from the exhaust. But no worries, this is completely normal. Whatever crap is still in the muffler has to burn off, and it took about 10 minutes for the smoke to completely go away. Okay, so at this point, I figured out my mistake with the throttle position sensors, so let's listen to the engine now. Not too shabby. The exhaust smoke has completely gone away, so that's awesome. So this doohickey is the secondary throttle, and that's how they govern the speed of the engine. If this guy doesn't work for one reason or another, the vehicle will be sluggish, and basically that's because this thing is restricting how much air the engine will get. It's a cool idea, but apparently these things have caused a lot of grief. Now over on the front of this thing, I went ahead and took off the plastics to confirm that the cooling fan worked when powered directly, and it works fine. Now on this here mule, the cooling fan is controlled by the ECU, and it's the ECU that determines when the fan should come on. So I'm kind of waiting for the engine to get hot enough so the ECU can kick in the fan. And about 10 minutes later, the fan did come on, so that's great news. Now, the engine does sound a bit noisy, or so it would seem. However, the noise is actually coming from the clutch. Meh, that's annoying, but it's not anything I'm interested in fixing. You see, as long as the engine's okay, I'm happy with this repair. This thing is a rabbit hole, and I reckon no matter where you look, you're gonna find something wrong with it. Anyway, let's take this thing for a quick ride. I'll shut up and let the folks who want to listen get a good earful of how this thing sounds. So it has full power now and it scoots. Not bad for a 20 horsepower engine. You know, I think off the line this thing is definitely a lot faster than my Honda Insight, both the gasoline and the diesel version. So good job Kawasaki, you finally beat a Honda. So this thing runs again, and that's good enough for me. You know, it's had a hard life, and no doubt there's many issues that'll need attention eventually. But the main thing is, the engine's repaired, and this thing can go back to the cattle farm, and its owner can use it for many, many more years. For some people, this thing is a toy, and for other people, it's just another tool in the toolbox. This type of vehicle is definitely handy to have on a farm, that's for sure. Now, I don't normally repair stuff like this, because that's not what I do. However, I figured this engine repair would make an interesting video. Actually, I was looking forward to digging into something like this just to see how it was built. It turns out this thing is a lot more complex than I thought it would be, and it isn't just an oversized go-kart. Anyway, all the parts including the filters, oil, and fresh coolant was about $130. Now the labor on this job was free because I got to use this in my YouTube video. But when you factor in 10 hours of labor just for cleaning everything and putting new gaskets in the engine, well, repairing something like this can get expensive real fast. Actually, I'm not even sure a real shop would have repaired the engine given the amount of hours it has on it. Plus, don't forget, it arrived with a crankcase full of antifreeze mixed with the oil, and that's never a good thing. I suspect the bearings in the engine have suffered a little bit, but the good news is the person who owns this thing will probably not be doing donuts in the cow pasture, and the engine will probably hold itself together just fine. Anyway, I had fun working on this thing and giving you folks something interesting and different to watch. We'll see you next time. Until then.